לחיים, מלך חפץ בחיים, וכותבנו בספר החיים, למענך אלוהים חיים. Once again, it is so nice to see everyone's faces in real time. Welcome to my colleague, Rabbi Josie Hudson. I'm glad you're with us. I'm not sure if Rabbi Calvin DaCosta is here, but if he is, welcome to him and to Shelley Fox as well. I see Shelley's mom, Kay. Nice to see you. And we're going to gather for our ritualized spiritual journeys this afternoon. And I say ritualized because it's become such a beautiful tradition in our synagogue to hear from three people to share their spiritual journeys. And we're going to hear from three very different, wonderful, wonderful human beings this afternoon. Our first speaker will be Dr. Susan Mandel. Our second speaker will be Leon Reyblatt, and our third speaker will be Samantha Page. All of them are members of our congregation. All of them actually have children who have grown up in our synagogue, and they all come from very different backgrounds. Without further ado, we're going to start with Dr. Mandel, Susie Mandel, and then we're going to hear from the three speakers in a row. And afterwards, I will ask a couple of initial questions of each of our speakers. And then depending on time, you can raise your hand going into the chat box under participants and press the click raise hand. But you might want to wait until the end of all three speakers to use that. And then I'll call on you depending on how much time we have. So welcome, Dr. Susie Mandel, and Gmar Chatima Tova to you. And you can begin. You have to unmute yourself, Susie. Good.
Gmar Tov, everyone. Wow, such challenging times these are. Dramatic shifts in our schedules and routines, the loss of our livelihood, separation from our loved ones, it's shaken each of us in one way or another. But one of the bright spots in all of this has been a chance to really examine our lives, to review and even redefine our priorities and our vision for our futures. As I look back on my own life, it's always easy to see the general path that brought me to where I am, my career, my relationships, but I've seen how easy it is to forget exactly how I came to know the direction of each step I was about to take. I'd like to speak a minute about what I call spiritual signposts. Most of us can recall experiences that almost felt magical, like those chance introductions to people who changed your life, or finding information you searched for, arriving in your inbox at just the right moment, or powerful dream messages or unexpected flashes of intuition. Or what about, do you ever keep seeing recurring messages on billboards or bus stop benches that seem to speak directly to you and the issue that you're dealing with? Sometimes there are funny little synchronicities that I call cosmic winks. Now, I have no idea if I made that term up or if I read it somewhere. Like when you hear a special song when you're thinking about a long lost love, just at that moment, your special song comes on. Or what about license plates? I've had so many license plates winking at me. A few years ago, a friend's brother unexpectedly passed away, and I was driving on the freeway listening to a song by Pink about losing a loved one, and it's called Beam Me Up. My friend and I had been listening to this song a lot in the days following her brother's death. At that very moment, a car pulled right in front of me on the freeway, and the license plate was BMME space YUP. Come on. It's in moments like these that I'm simultaneously reminded how much mystery there is and how connected we actually are to that mystery. Whether we describe it as a manifestation of God or the divine or universal wisdom or spirit, such moments make us feel alive and connected. These experiences ebb and flow in frequency and in intensity. When I'm actually looking for them, of course, they don't appear. In fact, it's often when I least expect it or in the darkest of hours that they arrive. Some of these experiences are far from pleasant. They can open the door to painful self-judgment, shame, regret, and fear. But typically it's beyond that door that we're given a chance to consider change, renewal, and even find healing. On Yom Kippur, we're standing at such a door. The fasting and reflection and the litany of possible decrees found in the Unatana Tokef prayer force us to face not only our mortality, but our vulnerability. Who shall live and who shall die? Who by plague? Who by violent acts? All hits far too close to home for many of us these days. This past February, my brother and I, both physicians, helped determine the day of our mother's passing. What is not included in the Unatana Tokef is who shall die by the decision of their children. Literally overnight, our mother went from planning a lunch outing with us to becoming acutely ill with a mysterious affliction, a sudden infectious illness that made breathing impossible. In a matter of hours, she had a cardiopulmonary arrest and was placed on a ventilator. When resuscitated a couple days later, she was shockingly fully alert, understood everything. She moved all limbs on command, but there was no medication, no intervention that could help her breathe. No clear diagnosis could be offered. Still intubated, she communicated with us by nods, gestures, and by squeezing our hands. For days, she pleaded to us through these gestures to pull out that tube. When the doctors finally felt it was time to give that a try, she subsequently endured intolerable breathlessness to the point that it was unbearable for all of us to witness. To have put that tube back in not only would have meant more suffering, but would have required a tracheostomy and transfer to a rehab facility, and there is no way our mother would have gone for that. The palliative care doctor helped us with our decision. We began asking Mom over and over if we should stop trying any further interventions. And we told her it was possible instead to just make her comfortable. By all indications, she let us know over and over again that the answer was yes, make her comfortable. So many unanticipated and powerful things took place during it all. But first, a little background. For decades, our relationship with Mom was complicated at best. There was frustration, anger, and resentment on all of our parts. For years, we hoped that taking care of her in her old age would ease that, but she was broken and wounded from past traumas. There was no repairing her emotional illness. I know I reminded her of my dad. She never let go of her hatred and resentment of him, despite their having divorced when I was 16 years old, and despite his passing away almost 20 years ago. My brother and I spent 7 agonizing days at mom's side in the ICU. And then, when the morphine was finally flowing through her veins, we spent another 15 hours sitting with her in a regular hospital room as she finally slept peacefully. We took turns sitting by her bedside, holding her hand. There were no more tubes, no struggling, just her rhythmic breathing. The grandkids came and went. We shared memories, laughter, stories. We all told her we loved her and kissed her on the forehead over and over. Sometime in the middle of the night, my brother, sister-in-law, and husband were dozing off in their chairs. The room was dark. I began to have this feeling that mom was resisting letting go. I then started seeing this tunnel of white blue light shining on us that was coming from the foot of the bed. And I was facing this way, holding her hand, and I turned my body to face this light in the direction mom was facing. I'm not sure how much I actually spoke aloud or how much was in my thoughts, but I distinctly remember telling her if she just let go, that she would fly off into that light like a bird. I sensed no response from her. Next, I had a vision that I was standing at the edge of a swimming pool, holding the hand as if she were a small child, encouraging her to jump into the pool. Just step off the edge, I said. It would be effortless, and I still sensed nothing from her. Then I started seeing this glorious hilly vista. And sitting there were her beloved deceased cousin Eleanor and Aunt Frances. I thought for sure this would delight her, but still nothing. Finally, I started to see my father's parents, my Nana and Papa, whom my mother loved probably more than her own parents. They were dressed up in their finest clothes. They were holding hands with each other, and the other arm was outstretched towards my mom as if to welcome her. The funny thing was, they were standing outside the doors of a casino. My mom loved blackjack. It was then I felt her start to let go, but not completely. There were other visions as well, and I can't recall them, although both Howie and my brother remember hearing me speaking of many things. So in the early morning hours, just as I was dozing off, she took her last breath. So during that hospitalization, I had come to see the bigger picture of my mother's life for the first time. Her wounds consumed her, and the single biggest heartache for us was always her inability to let go, to forgive, to move on. I began to realize that I was in fact guilty of exactly the same thing. It was at that moment that I could forgive her for my pain that I couldn't let go of. And it was then that the resentment I held on to all those years just simply lifted. For the first time in decades, I was filled with love, empathy, and sadness for my mother. Most importantly, in the end, I was able to genuinely express to her how much I loved her. One of the few things that always gave me warm feelings about my mother was when she would draw me this little cartoon bunny. When I was a little girl, I named him Bunny Eye because she drew him with very large eyes. Bunny Eye was on every birthday card I ever got my entire life. My mother just loved cute animals and stuffed animals, and she had given me many stuffed animals over the years. In her coffin, I put 2 stuffed bunnies, one on either side of her head, before we buried her. A week after Mom's passing, a dear friend invited me out to her beach house. The following morning, I woke up and I went downstairs to look out the big picture window towards the ocean. And then the most incredible thing happened. From the neighbor's yard, a small cotton-tailed bunny ran across and stopped on a path that was directly in front of me, about 7 to 8 yards away. And the path leads up a sand dune and over to the ocean. As I watched this bunny, she turned her body towards the ocean and scampered up and over toward the sea. I have little doubt that in that moment, Mom was telling me she had finally let go. Yom Kippur provides the opportunity to review our life without having to wait to face our own death or the death of a loved one. We can choose to repent and forgive and commit ourselves to performing acts of loving kindness in the year to come. If only we could live each day as if it was Yom Kippur, as if we were perpetually facing judgment and our mortality, if only. But even if this isn't possible, if we pause every now and then, pay attention to the signposts, review our behavior, our relationships, and our lives from a higher perspective, we may not succeed in tempering God's severe decree, but we can certainly find some peace amid the chaos of our days. Gemar Chatima Tova. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susie. Thank you. Really, really beautiful. Thank you for your vulnerability and your honesty. And now I'd like to welcome Leon Reyblatt, who will be our next speaker. Okay, Leon, you're on. You can unmute yourself.
Here we go.
There you go.
Okay, I'm on now. Thank you.
Perfect.
Hi, I'm Leon Reyblatt, and I'm gonna take just a slightly different turn on in the perspective of my spiritual journey. I grew up in Kiev, Ukraine, the country that was a part of the former Soviet Union, and immigrated to the United States as a refugee back in 1990s. Kiev is an urban capital city of Ukraine with population of over 2.5 million people. A couple of generations of my family lived and moved mostly within Ukraine and moved back to Kiev in 1950s. As Jews, we were never free to express our Jewish identity without fear of an altercation or political persecution. So the family was immersed in the Soviet cultural and art world.
This is Reyblatt.
So the family, so my parents were both engineers and were constantly reminded that to promote at work into a leading or administrative role, one had to be a serving member of the Communist Party. But the party imposed a quota on how many Jews could join. So I found especially ironic because Jews played a prominent role in the Communist Party from its inception. However, the history showed that domestic anti-Semitism that quickly made its way into the party leadership, and Jewish membership declined over the years. At school, I was constantly reminded of my Jewish identity. Not a week passed by without a heated verbal or physical altercation. My close friend would say, "Leon, you have a family in the States. Why don't you leave?" That was my wise Ukrainian friend speaking at the time. My mom used to reflect on these experiences by explaining that it's not their fault of growing up anti-Semitic. They were just fed this anti-Semitism with their mother's breast milk. My dad, on the other hand, believed in socialist ideology, even though he was never allowed to join the party. he accepted the challenges as a part of life there. When I applied for Civil Engineering Institute in Kiev, I was openly advised that the quota for Jewish applicants was capped at 2% of the incoming class. This domestic and government-sponsored anti-Semitism was a part of growing up Jewish in Ukraine. Yet many Jews made the living there acceptable, but many emigrated. Ukraine today does have a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister. Paradoxically, I find it as a classic example of success paired with a persistent discrimination. As a bit of a background, as a result of the 1918 revolution, Bolsheviks succeeded to abolish the Pale of Settlement that allowed Jews to live outside of a bordered area for the first time in over 110 years. Yet the Bolsheviks did almost nothing to stop the pogroms and continue the anti-Semitism and suppression of Jewish religion, tradition, and culture. As a result of this policy, my great-grandparents' family members were wounded and killed. Their Jewish library and all artifacts were burned in public display in 1919. Then, in 1941, the World War II started in the Soviet Union, and as many Jewish families experienced at the time, most of my extended family was murdered as a part of the Holocaust. Up to 1.6 million Jews were murdered in Ukraine alone. In a post-World War II, Jews continued to struggle under Stalin's ruthless control and oppression that ended lives of over another 600,000 people. Stalin, the Soviet president then, successfully frightened Judaism by killing or sending Jewish writers, artists, doctors, and lawyers to Siberian prison work camps. One of the tasks of the members of the Communist Party was to deport people who believed to be thinking differently from what the party required them to think. Any attempts to obtain Jewish texts was considered treason, and one would be sent to jail for years. The regime effectively made the Soviet Jews to assimilate in the culture of their resident country. Despite of all this oppression, my family always got together for Jewish holidays, but with no mentioning that those were Jewish holidays. Everyone was afraid of what if a kid tells a story that the family celebrated the Jewish holiday. It was almost a guarantee for at least one family parent to be fired from a job or be jailed. Growing up, I had no formal exposure to religion or Hebrew. One day, a family who was immigrating covertly gifted us a book in Hebrew. So during a holiday visit with my parental grandma, she opened a book and started to read in Hebrew and retell the stories to me. I felt the earth was shattering under my feet. Grandma Vera was 82 years old when she picked up a book in Hebrew to read the text with near full understanding after not being exposed to the language or having access to the literature since she was 16. When I heard her read the Hebrew book, I was astonished, surprised, shocked, confused, and finally so proud of her. I never knew she learned Hebrew. She spoke a bit of Yiddish with us, but Hebrew? I overwhelmed her with questions and we both cried. Later, my grandma told me that she had very few opportunities to read in Hebrew. She read in Hebrew in secret just a few times since school and was surprised herself to be able to read and understand the text. It was a powerful moment that represented the strength of my grandmother, who went through a lifelong struggle to withstand an active anti-Semitism and yet persevered to preserve the Jewish culture, tradition, and language. That was a moment I won't forget. I thought to myself, if my grandma could preserve the traditions and language for 6 decades, considering the life challenges that she overcame, I need to one day stand as a proud Jew next to her. Then the Soviet perestroika in 1989 came, the time when the Berlin Wall was taken down and the former Soviet Union dissolved into independent countries. That was the time of hope for us that the government-sponsored anti-Semitism would end in Ukraine. It slowly did for a brief moment, and then it took many turns back. I was trying to make sense of the situation and project the future. My dad would just got a permission to leave the country, as his engineering secrets were no longer considered secret to the government. My mom and I started to actively lobby my dad to leave, and our family finally left in the 90s. Then we come to America. The time of another turning point I'd like to share. It was around my mom's passing. It was also a time when Paulina, now my spouse of a couple of decades, and I were first in the first year of dating. My mom was very ill over many years with a solid collection of oncological diseases that ultimately took over her life. I matured early and was the primary caretaker of my mom. She was a strong-willed woman who fought one cancer after another with chemo and radiation therapies back in the 80s and 90s. My mom was lucky to meet Paulina. The experience of dating Paulina while my mom was in her last month of life was one of my spiritual turning points. There were so many emotions to enjoy and cherish as we were beginning to build our life. Yet I so desperately wanted my mom to be part of this new life. Even though as a family, we knew the day of her passing is about to come, I had a very difficult time grieving my mom in my 20s. We turned to Chabad for the burial services and the rituals, but didn't quite connect there for support. We didn't have a Jewish community to lean on at that time, but the family was with us, and with my dad, my brother, and I. Paulina was my light in the situation, who provided peace and comfort in the process. I cherished and celebrated experiences I had with my mother and worked on relating the values and experiences I had with her to our children. I'm delighted that our family found a home at TIOH. Paulina and I have been members since 2003. Both our kids have been part of religious school, B'nai Mitzvah, and active participants in the teen program. I know my late parents and grandparents would have been honored to see their grandchildren free and active in Jewish life. The Jewish life I could have only dreamed of when I was at their age.
Thank you so much, Leon. Thank you. It's a special treat that you gave us to be able to peer into your life as an immigrant. And we really cherish that. And now I'm going to invite our last speaker, Samantha Page, to share your story. So Samantha, welcome.
Thank you. Perfect. Thanks. Thank you, Rabbi Michelle. And it's wonderful to follow after both of those amazing stories. And it's so great to hear more of Leon's story. Both of our children had their B'nai Mitzvahs this year. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I remember Leon and Paulina saying just a tidbit of how special it was to have that moment after their histories. And so that was very special to hear more. So now I will take you on my little journey, which will take us in another direction. So give me 1 second. There we go. Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. We reflect on how we have wronged ourselves, others, our community, the planet, and how we have experienced being disconnected from God. Pondering our time together today, I've thought about how we prepare ourselves for this type of focused inner inventory on this one day. How do we know where to look or what questions to ask if we're not doing deep self-inquiry on an ongoing basis? Even as a child, I found it odd that this type of self-reflection was relegated to one day a year. Shouldn't we be doing this all the time? Shouldn't we bring this spirit to our daily lives so as to show up more fully for ourselves, each other, our world, and our spirituality? As a society, we tend to look outside of self for direction far more than we do within. This can be a mindless and often reckless approach to living. Personally, I learned the power of self-reflection the hard way. A regular connection to this inquisitive inner work was not always my way. For a long time, it was quite the opposite. For many years of my life, decades in fact, I looked outside of myself to source direction, happiness, and strength. I lived for years feeling like a stranger in my own life, often in or causing pain. Now, my work as a writer and artist through Last Cut Project focuses on the ongoing questioning that keeps us in conversation with ourselves and the world around us. But before becoming a teacher on self-sourcing direction in life, I had lost my way. At age 21, just weeks after returning from studying in Italy and days before my senior year of college, I was diagnosed with cancer. I was terrified, shocked, and angry, and yet did what I thought was expected of me. I pulled it together, put on a strong facade, and pushed through it. On the outside, I showed my best semblance of composure. Then I would retreat to my childhood room and cry for hours. I had yet to learn to process what brewed inside of me in a healthy manner. I had surgery and radiation and made my way back to a quote unquote normal life. I returned to college, graduated with my class, moved back to Italy to work, and tried to put a smile on my face at all times. I heeded to society's messaging on overcoming challenges. Hold it together, do things, be happy, return to a sense of normalcy. I outsourced my happiness and vision of success to the external prescriptions I had ingested. I kept going. I earned multiple degrees. I married someone who fit the description of who I had been told would make me happy. We bought a house, making a life and a family. I left practically no room in my life for processing the emotions often viewed as less than as I healed from cancer. I did not create space or outlet for the fear, anger, sadness, and longing that had built up within me from this shocking diagnosis. Throughout my 20s, I drifted further from myself. The sensation of feeling like a stranger in my own life deepened and strengthened its hold on me. I continued to do things out in the world that showed success, an assumed resiliency, and a return to my normal productive self, though nothing would ever truly be the same. Yet I would lie awake at night, unable to sleep, and contemplate the depths of fear, darkness, and an overwhelming sense of insecurity about my well-being. Depression, anxiety, panic attacks, and migraine headaches overcame me with a force in my daily life. I had not allowed myself to explore the full breadth of emotions around my cancer. I had not addressed the disconnect I was feeling with truth, honesty, or openness. The unprocessed trauma lived inside of me and forged other ways to the surface. I found myself in the emergency room and hospital with debilitating migraines far too frequently and ended up on disability from my job. During this time, I also tested positive for the BRCA1 genetic mutation, which indicates an elevated lifetime risk for breast and ovarian cancer, which further fueled my anxiety about my health. I was on autopilot in a rather self-destructive way. Prescription medications kept me afloat and my relationships suffered. Without any practice of ongoing and radically honest inner inquiry, I lived much of my 20s and early 30s in pain, within and without, until other medical events made me recognize the need for a different approach to living my life. Through my daughter's birth, which lasted 19 hours with late onset preeclampsia and required hourly refusal of my doctor's recommendation or insistence for a C-section, I found a renewed trust and connection to my body's strength. With her presence in the world, I opted for a preventive double mastectomy and reconstruction at age 32 in order to shift my health narrative to one of choice and empowerment. I wanted control over my body's destiny to the extent possible. My cancer trauma was stirred by that surgery, and I recall pulling my car over after a follow-up appointment at Cedars to call my doctor for help. I no longer wanted to compartmentalize what was happening on the inside from how I was living out in the world. I finally began to address my deep disconnect. Soon after, I received the best diagnosis yet, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, which allowed me to finally begin healing, or finally doing the healing necessary to rewire and heal. I stopped running from my pain and made a commitment to stay in the internal conversation, like the one we do today on Yom Kippur, but in an ongoing fashion. I sought to right the wrongs and to fix the places I had said yes instead of no, and vice versa. During my 30s, I atoned for my quote unquote sins, which I will define in this context as decisions made without integrity to self and others. I had not fully processed the emotions that surfaced with the cancer and had veered off course, not necessarily according to society, but definitely according to my soul. The recognition of the many disconnects I had been living resulted in divorce, moving, closing a business, and more. For many years, I reflected on whether my commitments were in line with who I truly am and how I want to be living my life. When I turned 40, yet another surgery, this time an explant surgery, to remove the implants from my mastectomy, helped me formalize the lessons learned over the years into workable tools. I created a 7-step framework that anyone can use to face any disconnect or sin they are experiencing within themselves or in life. The personal decision to remove something from within me that no longer felt in line with who I am led to Last Cut Project, which focuses on the significant decisions or last cuts that we all make to line up our inner worlds with the outer worlds that we create. By facing our inner truths head on to the best of our ability in any given situation, we're better able to take action more deeply connected to self. What do we have to remove, whether literally or figuratively, to be a more whole and authentic version of ourselves? Through my book, podcast, workshops, I've made it my life's work to stay in dialogue with myself and to bring these truthful conversations to my relationships, writing, teaching, activism, body, and soul. I'm committed to honoring the full spectrum of emotions that live within me as a human being so that I never again become a stranger in my own life. By living this way, I have a deeper connection to self, others, life, body, work, and my spirituality. I no longer live by a societal prescription, but source direction through an inner dialogue with self and my connection to spirit. Which brings us back to Yom Kippur. Focusing on where we have strayed with self or others certainly requires courage. It's far easier to remain indifferent or stay in the silence. While there's power in atonement on one focused day, for sure, I challenge all of us to imagine a world where we engage in powerful internal conversation on a consistent basis, with food, of course. The possibilities are vast. I hope you will join me in extending this inner inquiry beyond today to see how you feel and what we all can create together. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. Thank you, Samantha. So beautiful. Thank you to all of our speakers. Really, what a gift you've given all of us. I'm going to actually go back to Susie, Dr. Mandel, to ask the first question. And Leon, let me see if I can also bring you up. No, I can't. I can only bring 3 people up at a time. Okay. So Susie, you spoke a lot about there. Poof. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, James, in the background, pulling all the strings. Susie, you spoke about sort of intuitions and magical moments and messages. And you brought us through 4 of them, the bright tunnel that you saw at your mom's bed, and the swimming pool, and the vista with green grass, and then the bunny at the end. And my question to you is, do you think that everyone has the ability to receive these messages and understand these messages? Or do you think that certain people are just born with these gifts?
I think it's a matter of paying attention to them. I do believe everybody has them. And I think if people were to ask themselves honestly and look back over their lives, or when they've found some interesting synchronicity, they'd recognize that it's happening to them. I do believe that it's possible for us all to be awake and to hear them. And the biggest difference is whether we're receptive or not. I'm not always receptive. And I'm sure that's true for most of us. And a life's challenge has been seeking what it's going to take to be consistently awake and listening.
That was going to be my next question, which is, have you found that there are certain exercises or skills or things that you do to make yourself more open to those messages, more receptive?
Well, I've started, along the way, this began, I was drawn to the occult and the metaphysical from a very, very early age. I was given tarot cards at the age of 18 by somebody. And what I've done at various periods of my life is explored all the facets of it, all the facets of spirituality, whether it's intuitive, receiving intuitive information, or hands-on healing and transmitting energy, or channeling energy, or the Kabbalah. And currently I'm reading and learning a lot about esoteric thought. And I'm painting, and as part of painting, I'm learning about art history. I mean, it's a matter of exploring and moving outside of our box. You know,
Wow.
I'm a doctor. I could be reading medicine all the time, and that could be it. But I've always felt a yearning to solve, or at least to connect with the mystery. Wow,
beautiful. What you just said reminds me of how we open our Amidah, Adonai Tzefatai Titach Ufia Giti Latecha. Usually it's translated as God open up my lips, Sfatai, but the word Sfatai also means the boundaries and borders.
Yes.
So like, make myself more than just my box, in your case of medicine, right? Or in my case of being a rabbi, like go beyond that. Thank you. Thank you. Leon, you talked a lot about growing up with the fear of being Jewish, and how when your extended family would come together, that they didn't let you know that it was for Jewish holidays because somebody could lose their job. And you also talked about how many of your extended family was murdered during the Holocaust. And I wonder if you think that your upbringing was just random, or it was specifically given to you as a soul. And I ask that question also in tandem of your mother's death and meeting Paulina at the same time. Do you see that as random, or do you see that as someone orchestrating, or some power orchestrating that from outside of you?
It certainly didn't, I know, I guess from the naked eye it looked random, but I deeply believe that it was orchestrated by higher powers per se. At the time, going back to growing up in in Ukraine. We mostly lived as kind of our upbringing was similar to other Jews who experienced experienced the same environment that we were in at that time. Moving to the States, we're sincerely looking for better for a basic expression of Judaism first of all, and then also the somewhat better life. And our mom's passing was inevitable over the years, but certainly meeting with Paulina was brought a different light into my life and the life of my family.
Thank you. Just a heads up to everyone who is witnessing these spiritual journeys. If you have a question, go into your participants area and quote unquote raise your hand, and I'll call on you when I'm done with another question I'm going to ask Samantha. So Samantha, you talked about how when you were first diagnosed with cancer, you would go into your room and cry for hours, and that you didn't build a space for your fear and anger and sadness, and how that led to such a disconnect between your body and your soul. And then when you got your diagnosis of PTSD, to quote you, you said it was the best diagnosis ever. And I wondered if you could share with us more about why that was the best diagnosis ever for you.
Sure. I think in that diagnosis, it offered space for the fact that a trauma had occurred. I think that as a society, we can be so quick to wanting to get back to what was, or getting back to feeling quote unquote whole, but that doesn't allow for the space and the process to acknowledge the trauma. And in part, I think there's a survival aspect to that holding it together and getting through allows us to get to the other side of some of the terrible things that happen in life. But the reality is that when things happen to us, when traumas happen, we're forever changed. And so I think the true healing happens when you go in and actually acknowledge the trauma, acknowledge the full spectrum of emotions that came with that experience, and give space to that. And so I think for me, that diagnosis gave me permission that I had not given myself, or had felt even what I had seen out in the world, people wanting me to sort of have everything together because it was more comfortable, and it's sort of, oh, okay, she's okay. So in that, it was the acknowledgement of, okay, something terrible happened, let's deal with that, and then the actual holistic healing can happen, and it then creates space for allowing the beauty in. I mean, and when Susie was talking, I think in my world too, that then brought me into a space where I was able to clear out enough to then be in touch with who I am and connect with life in a very different way. And so different experiences then were coming into my life.
Thank you. All of you sort of spoke about how Yom Kippur is so important, and you wish we did this all the time. And I was thinking about how those Jews who pray daily in the Amidah, there is a prayer in the daily Amidah for tshuva. So we Jews actually don't leave it to once a year. We actually do have it in our Amidah 3 times a day. Not all of us liberal Jews, including myself, does that 3 times a day. But it is in there. And I'm thinking about how just listening to you, Samantha, the PTSD diagnosis not only gave you permission to go deep, but relief that you were seen in a way that nobody was seeing you before. And that when you had lived your former life of doing the right things and getting married and getting a house and getting a kid, that was all sort of masking what you didn't yet feel like you had permission or courage to dive deeply into.
Can I just say one thing on that too?
Yeah.
I think it's super relevant for all of us right now as we're living through this pandemic, because we can look back and say, oh, we can't wait for things to get back to where they were. But the reality is, in some fashion, even if it's just having had an enormous amount of people, known or unknown to us personally, who have died in our country because of this virus, we are forever changed, or even just having had to have been home, or all of the ways that this has affected us personally. And so I think if we don't deal with that collective trauma, we aren't moving forward in the way that we can to create space for a new beginning and a new way of viewing life. And so I think it's not just applicable to a specific illness. It's really anything that happens that feels quote unquote negative. How are we really breaking that apart, feeling it in all of its parts, so that we can then heal and move forward with a new vision of what that looks and feels like? Because anything that happens to us changes us permanently, good and bad.
Thank you. Thank you. Amen. I have one question from Susan Freudenheim. Susan?
My question was for Susie, but it really maybe could go to all of you. And Susie, you talked about you're a physician, and yet you talked about the occult and spirituality. And I just wondered about the intersection between those, and does one inform the other? They seem often, to those of us who are not in the sciences, like they're on, very separate paths. But I do know of many scientists and doctors who have a deep faith. And so I just wondered if you could talk about that a little bit and how one might inform the other. Thank you.
Unmute yourself, Susie.
For many years, it was not something that I broadcast. Let's put it that way, because at least by my colleagues, it was viewed in much the way you're talking about, like an anti-science. But it's not. It's actually not, because a lot of medicine and a lot of diagnosis and caring for people involves a great deal of intuition, and anything we can do to heighten our ability to hear beyond the words that people are saying is profound. And people who are seeking connection during times of crisis, like Samantha was talking about, in particular, when we were ready to transition. I mean, that's when everything I've read about and learned about, that's when it comes into play. And I have found that my patients appreciate my speaking about I mean, I could tell some amazing stories, but about being open to signs from deceased loved ones, for example. It can bring comfort, telling stories of experiences that I've heard about. My patients actually hunger for that side of me. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but for me, they go hand in hand. It may not for every doctor. For me, it's all the same thing. It's all healing.
Wow, thank you. We're gonna close now because I just want to give us at least a 4-minute break between the end of this and the book of Jonah. But I want to send a huge, huge thank you to Dr. Susie Mandel, to Leon Reyblatt, and to Samantha Page for exposing their vulnerability and their stories and their hearts with us on the heart of our year. Yom Kippur is really the heart of our year. So thank you for bearing your hearts on such a meaningful day. And I hope, and we hope, Rabbi Hudson and Rabbi DaCosta and Shelley Fox, we all hope that you have gained from hearing their stories, and that their stories enable each one of you to open your hearts to yourself and to your family and to those you love. So thank you again, Susie, Samantha, and Leon, and Gamar Chatima Tova. 4 o'clock, we will be showing the reading of the book of Jonah.
Thank you.